G'day all, how's it going? It's week 3, I guess. And this is kind of theory week. So I'm going to talk about really 5 topics across 3 videos. This one's about constructivism and a theory about learning, which we'll talk about a little bit. I'm going to talk about conceptual change theory and inquiry learning, probably both of which you've encountered to some extent or another in your junior secondary science courses. And then I'm going to talk about teacher explanations, the ways in which teachers explain concepts to students. And I'm going to talk about expertise, what it means to be an expert teacher, how an expert teacher differs from a novice teacher, and so on. It is kind of a heavy week of theory, but what I'll try to do all the way through is talk about what the implications of the theory are for the practice. As I've been saying all along, the goal here is to make you an informed, theoretically informed, critically informed, thinking practitioner, not a technician who simply carries out procedures understood by others. So that's the goal. I guess the other thing I'll say is that it's week 3. We know each other well enough now that I've chosen to go without the collared shirt and go with the metal band t-shirt, which is probably more my natural style. This is from The Algorithm, which is a French kind of genty, interesting instrumental band. Okay, constructivism, as I say, you may have heard about this before. I will give you a quick rundown on it though, because I think I have a slightly different perspective on it than many of my colleagues, many people in the field. And I think I can kind of outline where it's relevant to the field in ways that will help you think through what you're doing in your teaching and your students' learning. So constructivism is a theory in the field of epistemology. Epistemology is the branch of philosophy that's about knowledge. What do we know? How do we know? How can we know? What can we know and can't we know, and so on. So there are other branches of philosophy. There is axiology, which is the ethics. What should we do? What's the right thing to do in a particular situation? And there's ontology, which is the branch about reality. What's real? What constitutes reality? Are the things that we discover with science, like electrons and quarks, real in some final sense, or are they theoretical entities that we use to explain our experience that don't have a real existence? So we could have some very fun debates, probably at the pub with beers, for some of that ontology stuff. But for the moment, what I wanted to emphasize is that constructivism is a theory within philosophy, within the philosophy of mind specifically, and it's about learning. It's about how the brain works. And we'll talk about where it's come from and some of the historical perspectives on epistemology. It's not really a theory about teaching. You hear about constructivist teaching, but I'll talk more about constructivist referenced teaching. So I'll get to that in a moment. But just wanted to raise this idea of what kind of theory it is. It's a theory about how we learn. So the basic thing is students are not just empty vessels to be filled. We talk about the jug to mugs metaphor of content going from the mind of the teacher into the mind of the student. And we know that it's not that simple, that the students are all individuals, they have their own life experiences, they already have concepts in their head, and the new information that we put in has to interact with those concepts in some way. So there is this kind of conversation between the new experiences that they're having. Because I would say when we tell someone something, or show them a video, or show them an experiment, or get them to work with an interactive simulation on the computer, it's all experience. If I'm talking to you now, it's not really direct communication from my brain to your brain. It's an experience that you're having of certain words that I'm saying and actions that I'm doing and so on, out of which you're then constructing new knowledge. So we use the metaphor of constructivism, constructing like a building. You're constructing something, it's on foundations. So if you are building a house on a sloping hilly block versus on a flat block versus on a sandy block versus on a muddy block, etc., you have to take that into account in your construction. So similarly, when you're building new knowledge, you have to take into account the existing knowledge that you're building on the basis of. So that's part of the metaphor that helps. And then there is a structure to the knowledge. It's not just, you don't just turn up at the building site and put a pile of bricks and a pile of boards and some plaster and stuff all in a big pile in the middle and then say that's a house. There's a structure to it. There's a reason that things are connected the way they are. And similarly with our knowledge, that there is a structure to it. There are concepts that precede other concepts or that are required to understand other concepts. So in chemistry, for example, to really understand bonding properly, you have to understand electrostatics. You have to understand the force that positive charges and negative charges exert on one another, or positive and positive. So to really properly understand chemical bonding, you have to have this other concept. And then to really understand the behavior of chemical substances, why do metals conduct electricity, you need to understand bonding and what the electrons are doing and in the structure and so on. So our knowledge is connected, our scientific knowledge is connected in these particular logical ways. And it's built in. Knowledge in some way is represented. So as I say, I have a knowledge of constructivism. I've been writing, thinking, etc. about it for a very long time. I published a paper in 1997, so 22 years ago. That's been cited a lot. A lot of people found it useful in thinking about constructivism. I wrote that when I was doing my doctorate. So it was my, in some ways, attempt to think my way through these concepts. I've been teaching about them ever since. So clearly my knowledge is an expert knowledge in some sense. It's very well elaborated. It's complex. There are layers, there are different metaphors and similes and images of how to teach it and so on. So, but I can't just give that to you. It'd be nice if we could do the matrix thing and, plug something into the back of our neck and just transmit it from one person to another. Although, again, it would still have to somehow integrate with the rest of your knowledge, which is quite different from the rest of my knowledge. You probably may not know who the algorithm are, for example. So knowledge can't be directly transmitted. I have to break my knowledge down in some sense into words. I have to choose which words I'm going to use, which concepts, which metaphors. Those words go across to you. You might mishear them. I might misspeak or stumble or pick the wrong word or mutter. You might associate that with something completely different to what I had in mind and so on. And so then you take that experience of my speech act and turn that into knowledge in some sense. And it won't be exactly like my knowledge. Hopefully it will be similar enough that your knowledge is in some sense correct. Among other things, you have to answer a multiple choice question about some of this stuff today. So we have to have our knowledge similar enough so that you can correctly answer the question. And similarly for students in our classes, they will develop their own knowledge of a scientific concept, but it needs to be similar enough to the canonical, correct, accepted by scientists, best current explanation of that concept so that they can pass tests, so that they can use it, so that they could write scientific papers and do experiments and so on. So the knowledge that we construct won't be identical because we're all different individuals building on different foundations using different materials, but it will be similar enough for our purposes, and that might be all we need. So, excuse me, a few theories about constructivism. So there have been a number of perspectives. You've probably heard most about Vygotsky because it's been the flavor of the month for about 40 months so far. But Piaget was kind of the first. He was the granddaddy. Piaget was French-Swiss. He had a stage theory about development, so concrete to abstract thinking and so on. But he mainly talked about constructivism. He considered himself to be a genetic epistemologist. Now that's not genetic as in genes and DNA and RNA and so on. That's genetic as in the genesis of, the start of. So he was interested in the genesis of knowledge. Where does knowledge begin in children? How does it grow? And he talks about this concept of assimilation and accommodation. So if you have an existing network of knowledge, and this is related to what I said about sequential and global thinkers before, and this is part of why I'm starting to gesture again. Remember that I said for global thinkers, they want a big network, and then they want to assimilate bits into it. So assimilation is you've got an existing concept or an existing framework, mental framework, schema, he calls it, and you can keep poking new information into that. It kind of fits that structure. That's assimilation, and that continues over a long period. He says at some point, the structure is no longer powerful enough to explain or contain or connect to all the new information. And you have to restructure it. You have to rebuild the thing. And that's what he calls accommodation. Accommodation, you change your conceptual structure in order to learn and grow. Couple of metaphors for this. One is that Robert Pirsig, who wrote Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, talked about developing his concepts for the books as a wall covered in yellow stickies. So you would have a yellow sticky with a concept on it, and you'd put it in the thing, and there was categories of ideas on the wall. And so you would put more and more stickies into each. But then at some point in the process, it would become obvious that that category system wasn't working. So you would put all the yellow stickies down, create a whole new category system, and stick the things in their new categories. So assimilation while you're adding it to the existing categories, accommodation when you change the category system and start over. Another example, in biology, you know that a mammal basically is a thing that has warm blood and fur and suckles its young with milk when they're tiny, and gives birth to live young. And a bird is a thing with a beak and 2 legs, wings, etc., that typically lays eggs. So if you come to Australia as a new botanist, no, botanist is plants, a zoologist, and you're dividing these weird new Australian animals, it's, you know, kangaroo, mammal, easy, emu, bird, easy, bowerbird, lyrebird, wombat. So you're fine. You're using your existing, you're assimilating the new animals into your existing category system, and then you hit the platypus and the echidna. But let's take the platypus. Okay, fur, warm blood, suckles its young, butt, beak, lays eggs. Where does it go, left or right? Bird or mammal? Doesn't really fit either. So what the zoologist did was say, all right, we are going to chicken out of recreating the whole scheme, because it works mostly in most of the world, and we're going to create this new little niche called the monotremes that has the platypus and the echidna in it. These kind of weird non-placental, or these weird kind of Australian animals that don't neatly fit the mammal or bird category, because echidnas also lay eggs. So that's an example of accommodation. They had to change the category structure because it was no longer powerful enough to get the job done. So assimilation accommodation is how Piaget says our knowledge grows, and both are necessary. We tend in all of these to go, you know, hierarchical system, concrete bad, abstract good. No, no, no. Lower order thinking bad, higher order thinking good. No, no, no. All necessary, all essential. You just want to make sure you're doing all of it. If you're doing only lower order thinking, bad. You want to make sure that you're doing all of it. And so you need, assimilation is really important. Accommodation is sexier because it's more dramatic, but they're both really important. They're a dynamic duo that works together. Okay. George Kelly is much less well known than the other ones. So Kelly wrote some really interesting stuff in 1955. He was an engineer, so he wasn't a philosopher, he wasn't a psychologist, he was an engineer who wanted to understand how people learn. So he has a very engineer-like system. He's written one fundamental postulate and then 12 corollaries to that fundamental postulate, and it's very, very logical and clear. But what it all boils down to is that humans basically are doing experiments on the world around them. They're trying to come to understand. It's what humans inherently do. And one of the cool things that Kelly has is this notion that, you know, I guess Freud, as a psychologist or psychiatrist, suggests that we're driven by kind of sex and death and our desires and the id and all of that kind of stuff. Kelly says we are driven as humans by the desire to understand, and we'll pursue the alternative, if we have a choice, that leads to greater understanding or greater learning. So it's nice as teachers to think about students as wanting to learn, as being actively engaged in learning, about caring to learn. But one of the things with that is, if looking out the window at whatever's going on outside the classroom offers more possibility for learning than whatever the teacher is going on with, that's what the students will choose. It's not that they're being naughty or wicked or you know, unfocused, whatever. They are doing exactly what humans do, which is pursuing the greater possibility of learning. If checking out the cute boy across the other side of the classroom it seems to offer greater possibilities of learning, they'll do that as well, right? So what we want them to learn is not necessarily the thing that they're most eager to learn. In fact, you know, there are lots of other things that they would love to learn about the world that we can't let them learn about the world at school. And so, you know, part of what we have to do is make what we are doing engaging enough that that's the choice they'll make. He also said, you know, that and this is actually related to Piaget as well, this notion that we test our concepts against the world, and we test them against language, and we'll get to Vygotsky in a minute, but if a baby is, or a small child, a toddler, is looking at animals in a book or animals in a field, they will tend to say dog or bow wow or puppy for four-legged furry things. And we will say, yes, yes, that's right, puppy, when they get it right. And when they get it wrong, we'll say, no, 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 that's a kitty, or that's a sheep, or whatever it happens to be. So they're developing their concept of dogness. Now, the concept of dog is quite broad. If you go from Chihuahuas and Shih Tzus to Pit Bulls and Great Danes, there's a huge amount of very, very different looking things that the concept of dog has to cover. But humans create that concept by doing these experiments with the world and with the social world as well as the material world. So the language they're developing in the context of the social world. And what we're doing when we do that, we do these experiments so that next time I point to something and say dog, I'm more likely to be right. In other words, I'm trying to predict future experience by understanding past experience. That's what we're doing when we're developing concepts. This is a nice theory. It's relatively simple. The way Kelly puts it in language is more complicated, but the concept is relatively simple, that what we're trying to do is figure out the future by experiencing the past, but then coming to understand the past, coming to grapple with it and to understand it in some rich way. Radical constructivism is less influential. Glassersfeld had a bit of a fashion, a bit of a flavor of the month for a while, but he talks about it. I would say radical constructivism, which is his brand, has two bits. The first bit is uncontroversial and it's just normal constructivism. Learners construct new knowledge on the foundations of their existing knowledge. That's what all constructivists say. Second bit, which is the radical bit, is the knowledge we create tells us nothing about reality, it only helps us to function. Now, to me, that's an ontological claim. It's a claim about what's real. It's not a claim about how we know, or at least it's a claim that what we know is not real. And that's a claim in the realm, well, across epistemology and ontology. It's interesting. Again, it's that kind of dorm room philosophical conversation that you might have, or conversation you might have over a beer with friends, but it's kind of bootless because our concepts do work. Newton's laws work, Einstein's descriptions work, and so on and so on. So the concepts do work. So whether or not we have direct access to unfiltered reality, or whether we have some kind of mediated access to reality, does it matter? I'm not sure. Anyway, it's nice for philosophical bull sessions and having a rave with your mates, if that's the kind of thing that you like. But I don't know that it's hugely influential for teaching, because it's also pretty abstract for teenagers to try and get their heads around. So Piaget was quite individualist. He talked a lot about he did a lot of his research on his own kids. He kind of watched his own kids playing with liquids in jars and objects and so on, and wrote about that. So he didn't do a lot of experiments where he brought in randoms and experimental conditions. He tried to understand the experience of his own life. Solomon said, look, humans learn in social context. They don't typically learn by sitting in a place with material stuff and just playing with it themselves. So Piaget was talking about things like object permanence. If you take the object and hide it, does the baby understand that it still exists and go looking for it? Or is it no longer in the world from the baby's perspective? He talked about the ability to judge volume. So if the liquid is this deep in the wide cup, how big will it be in the narrow cup? And will the child know that it's the same amount of liquid even though it looks bigger? He talked about those kind of things. So it's humans interacting with the world, which is obviously relevant for science. Relevant, I didn't say irrelevant. Solomon said, well, yes, that, but there's lots of human stuff. There is the humans correcting whether you got dog right or not, for example. There's lots of human interaction. So learning takes place in social contexts. So Joan Solomon emphasized that social element to learning. The fact that parents, teachers, peers, classmates, other people in society, Bill Nye, Miss Frizzell, Dr. Carl, there's a bunch of people who, Neil deGrasse Tyson, people who influence kids' scientific understanding, who aren't necessarily their teachers, but who the learning takes place in social context. One of the things with this is, if you take the example of the kid who comes to school and says, there are two kinds of electricity. There's positive in one terminal and negative in the other terminal, and when they get together, they create light. And the teacher says, well, no, not really. In science, we say that there are electrons. The electrons are flowing from the positive toward the negative, or the other way around. Depends whether it's being used as a cell or an engine. We won't get into that because it's a bit too physicsy. But the teacher says the canonical scientific concept, and the kid says, well, my dad's an electrician, and he said that it's two kinds of electricity. Well, that's a hard row to hoe. To get that child to change the concept is going to be challenging, because there's just that social thing of, this is the concept that I've had for a long time. I learned it at my parents' knee or whatever. And my dad is my dad, who has authority, and my dad is an electrician, so he has kind of vocational, positional authority as well. So am I going to believe you, or am I going to believe the teacher? And that's also not one that we can easily remediate with an experiment. We can't show them the electrons traveling from one place to another. And in fact, actually, a concept with two kinds of electricity probably explains most simple circuits as well as a single direction flow of electrons. So that's kind of a little bit off the path, but it is that concept of, there are all these other social influences. So we'll talk in a couple of weeks, I think, about teaching controversial issues in class, and if the parents at home are anti-vaxxers or creationists, or have any flat earthers, or have any of a wide range of views on things, some valid, some not valid, it can be really hard for the teacher to actually kind of work in that social context, because the student is not just an empty slate that you fill up with the correct scientific knowledge. They are a human that has been living in the world and coming to understand the world for a long time, and they will have all of these other social influences on their learning and understanding. Vygotsky, Lev Semenovich Vygotsky in the Soviet Union, actually did his work before Piaget, but because it was in Russian and because it was the Cold War, it didn't come to the West until later. So in the West, typically we knew about Piaget in the 70s and Vygotsky in the 80s and 90s, but Vygotsky actually did his work before Piaget, as I say. He talked about this social role as well, and he talked about the fact that culture and language are really important as well, that you're actually learning within a particular human culture that has assumptions about knowledge, about what is true, about what is real, and so on. So, a pre-scientific society would have kind of angels and demons and household fairies and a whole variety of things which were considered as real entities and used to explain experiences. A scientific perspective on the world tends not to include those entities. Again, we can talk in more detail later, but it doesn't necessarily exclude them, but it doesn't use them to explain physical phenomena. Typically, you don't explain the heating of metal using a miracle in science. But Vygotsky was kind of attending to the importance of culture in learning as well, the way in which it contextualizes the learning of individuals, and the ways in which learning actually happens collectively in some sense. And it's perhaps not surprising that the guy in the Soviet communist world, which was all about collectivism, was more focused on collectivism, and the people in the capitalist West who were focused on individualism got more into individualism. Perhaps that's, I don't know, maybe I'm over-interpreting. Okay. The zone of proximal development you are probably familiar with, I imagine. If not, just a really quick rundown. So the ZPD, as Americans would say it, or ZPD as we would say it, zone of proximal development. If the student can do everything up to this level by themselves already, right? They're already competent to do everything up to this level. Beyond this level, they can't do it even if we help and scaffold them. So everything from here up, they're just not capable of yet. They're not ready. They don't know enough. They can't do enough. In between these two, so stuff they can do by themselves already, stuff they can't do even with help. In between the two is stuff they can do with help. And that's the zone of proximal development. The thing that students can do if we give them some scaffolding and support. And that, according to Vygotsky, is where learning takes place. If we can scaffold them beyond the stuff they already know how to do, toward the stuff they can't do, that's where they will actually be able to develop and learn. So that scaffolding can be parents, teachers, peers, materials, books, experiments, videos, simulations, all of that kind of stuff. But that scaffolds them to get beyond where they are to where they need to be. Now, the zone of proximal development will be different for different students in the class, but hopefully there's enough overlap in at least some subgroups of the class that you can differentiate. So, okay, you guys are working in your zone of proximal development here. You guys are working in a different zone of, different but not inferior, zone of proximal development over here, and so on around these topics, so that you're actually making sure that students are getting challenged at the level they want. If you're trying to challenge them down here in the zone of what they can already do, they're bored because they can already do it. If you're trying to challenge them up here above the zone of what they can possibly do, they're frustrated because they can't do it, right? You need to be keeping them in there because that's where they're going to be engaged. That's where they're actually going to be able to work, learn, grow, feel challenge. And I think I mentioned this already, but we often assume that students will like school more if we make it easier, but it's actually not the case. They want to be challenged. It goes back to Kelly. They are motivated by wanting to learn more. So what we need to do is make it feel like they're challenged, make it feel like there's forward momentum, make it feel like they're learning more and have the opportunity to learn even more, rather than dumb it down, because dumbing it down actually doesn't make them happier. Although they might think it would, but it really doesn't. So I said right at the start, constructivism is an epistemological theory. It's a theory about learning and teaching. It's a theory about knowledge. And so from a theory about knowledge, we logically infer ideas about learning from a theory about knowledge. So constructivism is a theory about what we know, how we come to know. And so learning is implied by that. But there are multiple kinds of learning that you could draw from a constructivist perspective. And then from views about learning, we logically infer ideas about teaching. If learning is thus and so, then teaching should be thus and so. These are the ways that we do it. So the point that I would make with this is that there's a very wide range of activities that can be called constructivist referenced teaching. As I said earlier, I wouldn't say constructivist teaching, I'd say constructivist referenced teaching, because it's teaching that's consistent with a constructivist concept of what people know and how they come to know. And as I say, I talked about a number of different brands of constructivism. So personal, social, socio-cultural, and so on. But constructivism at base is just this idea that learners actively construct knowledge in their mind. The other thing I'd say is that sometimes we hear active learning talked about. That's something that John Dewey talked about 100 years ago. But active doesn't necessarily mean physically active, doesn't mean active hands, doesn't mean group work and experiments and stuff. Necessarily, it can be all of those things. Active minds is where the key is. What you want is that their minds are actively engaged with their learning rather than passively absorbing, because they're actually not that good. We as humans are actually not that good at passively absorbing and then perfectly regurgitating. Some of our assessment schemes seem to think we are, but we're really not. So if you're actively constructing and then actively constructing your answers on the exam, you're in a much better place. So I hope that's helpful. The other thing that I would say is that we often think about understanding students' prior knowledge, because the metaphor for constructivism is that that's the foundation that they build on. So we should understand what they know already. But the temptation is to go, okay, I want to understand their prior knowledge. I'm going to give them a quiz that asks them about the thing they learned about this last year. But that's not really their prior knowledge. That's just the school facts that they've retained. Their prior knowledge is much richer and more complex than that. So, for example, they will we'll get into some inquiry and some conceptual change and some other things that will help us think about how we understand prior knowledge. But prior knowledge should be understood as a network, as a complex structure with construction that has particular features and particular rooms that do particular things to beat a metaphor to death, rather than just simply here's the heap of facts that they've managed to retain from their earlier schooling. So, okay, this piece on constructivism, I've put it first, and I hope you watched it first because it does lay the ground for the remaining pieces of this week's concepts that we're going through. So, thanks a lot, and onward.